You're going to see a lot of content creators going over Ultimate Cup deck profiles, and with modified rules it's a whole new game with restrictions to colors based on your eggs. This doesn't necessarily mean that you can't play Black War Greymon X anymore, it just means you've got to be a bit more creative with your build. The new modified rules indicate a few things. Number 1, players must construct a deck and Digi-Egg deck using cards of only one color. That doesn't mean multicolor cards are out, just certain other cards if you want to play them. For example, if you use a black Koromon, you're welcome to cross into red territory if and only if the Digivolving Digimon has black as well, meaning Metal Greymon X, Black War Greymon, and Black War Greymon X are all valid to play in not just red, but black as well. But you know what this does prevent you from doing? X-Antibody. While Black War Greymon X does use this also nerfs Melga X decks in some ways. Now you might be thinking, but Digi-Panda, this makes Grandis and Mastamon decks have a field day. Don't worry, they made a restriction list as well for the March and April Ultimate Cups. At 1 copy now are Promo Grand Kuwagamon and Chaos Degradation. This nerfs security control in some ways, considering with the color restrictions you either go all in for your purple tamers, but lose your predominantly good yellow options for recovery, or you go pure yellow and lose your purple tamers. And finally, they did indeed ban certain cards. Death Xmon for obvious reasons, Wear Garurumon X because restand shenanigans, but still, you wouldn't be able to run the X-Antibody for the fact that your babies aren't white. And finally, Cerberusmon Werewolf mode for loop shenanigans. Generally speaking, this prevents a lot of the top end decks from competing. Jessmon now can't do anything without Sistermon and Chimeramon, and none of your inheritables would trigger without the presence of them. As mentioned before, Black War Greymon X and Metal Garurumon X lose a lot of their offensive and defensive potential without X-Antibody and the different Omnimon variants. Examon loses the ability to use your green and blue components with a lack of a dual-colored egg. Crossheart? Don't even get me started. No more splashing red and blue flare variants, and even Grandis decks lose the blue splash from Davis Motomiya. So in the end, which decks are competitively viable? You've seen other creators dive into this very question, but for me personally, it's also important to look into which decks have the best security bombs and counter-offensive strategies. Ulforce, while very powerful and can check multiple security, requires specific cards to give it that kill potential. In my mind, it's a slower Metal Garurumon X that's more fair. But in terms of decks that have a good balance of offensive and defensive strategies, here are my top 5 choices when it comes to playing in the Ultimate Cups. Number 5. Bloom Lordmon. While green suffers from being Bandai's guinea pig colored, you have to admit, when drawing all the right cards you can build very white boards. And without Death Xmon now, there's only one thing to fear: Crimson Blaze. But when you go off, you have a lot of offensive potential that can also be defensive. Number 4. Galacticmon. I honestly put this deck as high up here as it is because it's relatively unknown to the general play population. That being said, Black has a lot of powerful option cards that not only delete, but also de-Digivolve as well. De-Digivolve is a very powerful mechanic that when utilized in certain decks, it can be good. But without the power of X-Antibody, this deck just does it better. Number 3. D-Brigade likewise has a lot of access to the powerful Black option cards. But while Black option cards may be defensive, the D-Brigade engine itself has many members that have made it rise into a niche rush style of deck for new and old players. In addition, the deck is relatively cheap. Number 2. Blue Hybrid. The little demon from hell returns. There's so much source stripping that this deck could make a return. It has a versatility, and without big bad Black War Greymon or even Tamer destruction running around as much, what do you have to be afraid of? While yes, players could run Hades Force in their red or black decks, this deck requires a high level Greymon Digimon to use optimally. Blue Hybrid lets you strip, stun, and with cards like Innocence, Blizzard, and Sorai, this gives fodder for Sora and Joe to shine once again. In addition, because X-Antibody is just not present, source stripping becomes more relevant. And finally, number 1. D-Reaper. This deck is stupid cheap and honestly one of my top choices going into Ultimate Cup. While yes, you may be thinking, but Digi-Panda, this deck sucks. You lose Starmons and other defensive option cards. I get it. But there are other white option cards out there that can do work. X-Program may be 8 memory, but think of the number of X-Antibody related Digimon moving into this specific format. Realistically, your only X-Antibody Digimon that may appear in the entire card game at this point is Gallantmon X, Grandis, or even Magnamon X. But none of the main heavy hitters will be present. Because if your opponent checks it, pop goes one of their main bodies. But on the flip side, this card is a double-edged sword because it will delete your own board if you hard play it for 8. So keep your board at a minimum. But this also does give you access to X-Antibody option cards for preventing your sources from being stripped, or stunned for that matter, from blue hybrid decks. While this list doesn't cover anything like Machine Dramon, Blue Flare, Black War Greymon, or yellow variants like Venusmon, I feel these decks require much more setup to make it really count. Security-based decks like Beelstarmon also lose a color, meaning you lose access to blue option cards and even tamers that previously drew you cards. And although people may have been upset with the announcement of these rules, which I completely understand, this does open a bit of freshness with the card game that seemed to be repeating with each format. So BT7 dropped and we played Blue Hybrid. The deck is super good. So good that it overshadowed any deck possible in BT8. Armor Purge? Nah, I'll just strip your Digivolution sources. Come BT9, everyone was hyped for X-Antibody Digimon, and with Blue Hybrid's restriction, this left a gap where new decks could thrive. But come BT10, the short-term Crossheart deck got wiped out, and it's been predominantly X-Antibody since then. Even with BT11, a majority of decks still had decks that had X-Antibody related themes with it. So in the end, coming up with new formats breathes new life and creativeness into the game. Is it fun when the format's already figured out? Mind you, it does become a challenge of can you beat the meta deck? But in terms of brewing, this is where the real fun begins. Let me know your thoughts on what you think will top Ultimate Cup with these new restrictions, and I'll catch you next week on another meta topic. This is Digi-Panda, logging out.